and thank you for joining us. My name is Katie Perez, and I'm a senior associate at Scott Legal PC. Today, we are going to spend some time talking about the TN requirements. Specifically, this webinar will clarify the requirements for obtaining a TN visa with a focus on the common misconceptions regarding sponsorship. Just a few things before we get started. Some of you may know that the firm was founded on an E2 visa several years ago. Our founder, Ian Scott, is in the US on an E2 visa and has been on several different visas, including an F1, a TN, a B, and an H1B. Scott Legal PC is a full service immigration law firm, and we offer immigration services in several different areas, including the E2, E1, TN, L1, family immigration, national interest waivers, EB5, extraordinary ability visas, and more. We will continue this webinar series doing at least 2 webinars a week on different topics. At the end of this webinar, we will send out several useful tools. We will send you a copy of the PowerPoint presentation from today, a link where you can download guides that go through the visa options in more detail, and also a link where you can sign up for more webinars. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on YouTube. We will also send the link for that. We encourage you to subscribe and hit the notification button as we regularly upload immigration videos on a wide variety of topics. We'll also send you a link where you can arrange a consultation with one of our experienced immigration attorneys if you would like to discuss your case in more detail. If you have any questions throughout the presentation, please put them in the chat box and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Today, we're lucky to have our Senior Associate, Dustin Saldariaga, as our presenter. Dustin is a Senior Associate with Scott Legal. He graduated from Harvard Law School and works on a number of different visas, including the TN visa. So without further delay, we will get started with the webinar.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you all for joining for our webinar today on the TN visa. We can go ahead and go to the next slide.
Okay, great.
All right, so let's start by talking about what the TN visa requirements are. When someone comes to us and they're from either Canada or Mexico and they're looking to fill a job in the US, the TN visa is almost always going to be the first thing we look at. And the reason for that is it really is one of the most straightforward and streamlined and fastest options for nationals of Mexico or Canada to come to the US to fill a job. But there are a few requirements that you do need to meet to actually get a TN visa. The first thing is that you need to be a citizen of Canada or Mexico. And fortunately, that really only means that you hold a passport from Canada or Mexico. So if, for example, you were born in India and you became a citizen of Canada in later years, that's fine. As long as you have a passport from Canada or Mexico, you meet this requirement. The second requirement is that you need to be coming to the US to fill a job in one of the listed professions. And when I say one of the listed professions, I'm talking about the professions that are listed in the TN regulations. And I'm going to be referring to the TN regulations throughout the presentation. So if you are at your computer or at your phone, I'd recommend you go to Google and just Google NAFTA, N-A-F-T-A, TN regulations, and actually click on those regulations. They're actually quite easy to understand. One of the things that they do is they actually list dozens of professions. So they start with accountant, they go to architect, computer systems analyst, they include mathematicians, dentists, pharmacists, psychologists, biologists. There really are dozens of professions listed in the NAFTA regulations. So you do need to be coming to the US to work in one of these listed professions. Now, even though there are dozens of professions listed, there are many professions that are not listed. So, for example, you won't see any professions in marketing, for example. So do make sure that if you're coming to the US to fill a job, it is in one of these listed professions. The next requirement, you need to have the required qualifications to practice that profession. Now, this is not the qualifications that the US employer is looking for. The US employer might be looking for someone with 20 years of experience or with a PhD. What we mean when we say you need to meet the qualifications, it is the qualifications in the regulations. So again, let's go to the regulations and let's look at, to take an example, economist. So to come to the US as an economist, you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. That's it. So you cannot, for example, come to the US as an economist if you don't have a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. So, for example, if you uh, finished high school and you got a job working in an office as an economist and you've been doing this for 20 years, you are not going to qualify for a TN as an economist because you need a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. And you notice that this requirement is different depending on which profession you're coming to the US to fill. So if we look at accountant, you can qualify with a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree or a professional license, a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. If we look at management consultants, you'll see you can qualify based on a baccalaureate or licenciatura degree or equivalent professional experience. So up to and including, excuse me, equivalent professional experience as established by a statement or professional credential attesting to 5 years of experience as a management consultant or 5 years of experience in a field of specialty related to the consulting agreement. So what that means is you can qualify as a management consultant based on 5 years of experience, even if you don't have that baccalaureate or licenciatura degree. So, step one is making sure you have the nationality. Step two is making sure you're coming to the US to practice in one of the listed professions. Step three is making sure you meet the qualification requirement for your profession as that qualification is defined in the regulations. Now, next, you do need to have a prearranged job for a defined length of time with an employer in the US. So, what this means is you actually do need a job offer from a US employer. The TN visa is not a visa that can be used to come to the US to look for a job. You actually do need to have that job offer in place. And the job offer needs to be for a defined length of time. So typically, a that time period is going to be 3 years or less. We'll talk a little later about why you might want to have less than 3 years as your time period in the job in the U.S. But in general, the maximum that an employer will be requesting or that you will be looking for in TN status is 3 years. And that's really just because each time you enter the US in TN status, you're given 3 years of TN status. Now, that being said, it is perfectly fine to renew your TN visa as long as you remain eligible and you continue to have an eligible US employer that's supporting you. It's fine to ask for 3 years and at the end of that 3 year period to apply for TN status again. We'll talk a little bit more about that later. But in the initial application for TN status, you would typically be asking for 3 years of status in one of the listed professions. The next requirement in your job, your profession that you're coming to the US to fill, you actually need to be employed to engage in the professional activities consistent with that profession. So, what does this mean? Excuse me. Let's say that let's say that you have a degree in economics and a US employer reaches out to you because they need help marketing their company. You are very good at social media, you're really good at YouTube, you're really good at Facebook, and they need to hire you to really improve their social media presence. So your plan is to apply for a TN visa as an economist because again, you have the degree, and then to come to the US and basically build out this social media campaign for this company. That's going to be a problem. And the reason that is going to be a problem is the government, the US government, does not see economists as helping with social media campaigns. That's just not what economists do. How do I know that? The reason I know that is because the US government actually publishes uh, the job duties that they associate with professions. This is in a resource called the Occupational Outlook Handbook, which we call OOH for short. It's published by the Bureau of Labor Statistics, which is within the US Department of Labor. And if you Google, since we're talking about economists, if you Google OOH economists, and you click that link, you'll see a tab at the top of your page that says what they do. If you click that, you'll see what economists do. This is what the US government thinks economists do. And you'll actually see a heading, duties. Economists typically do the following. They research economic issues, they conduct surveys, they collect data, they analyze data using mathematical or statistical models, they interpret and forecast trends, they advise businesses, government, and individuals on problems related to fiscal policy or other economic topics, and they present their research. And you see there's more that's on this page, but this is the US government saying what they think the profession of economists uh, do. So when you are going to the US government, whether that's a border officer or a consular officer, and you're saying, I'm going to come to the US as an economist, the first thing that that government officer is going to do is check what their government thinks should be done in that role. So you do need to be coming to the US to perform the job duties that are consistent with what is said in the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And again, I've been looking at economists. You can search OOH for dentists, for mathematicians, statisticians, any profession you can search on the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So it is a good idea to always make sure that if you have that job offer in the US in a certain profession, that the next thing you do is make sure that what the US employer wants you to do in the US, your job duties, are going to be consistent with what's in the Occupational Outlook Handbook for your profession. Now, your job duties don't have to be copied and pasted from the Occupational Outlook Handbook. And in fact, that would be a bad idea. But the job duties do need to be consistent. So they need the majority of your job duties do need to be consistent, aligned, similar with what is on the Occupational Outlook Handbook for your profession. And one last note, I mentioned before that for certain professions, you can qualify based on your degree, a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree. A very common question we get is, well, I have a bachelor's degree or a baccalaureate degree, but it's in a field that's not identical to what I'm coming to the US to do. So let's say you're coming to the US as an economist, you have a baccalaureate degree, but it's in English. Unfortunately, that is going to be difficult. Not impossible, but difficult. The government does tend to require that your degree, if you're qualifying based on a degree, that your degree is related to what you're doing in the US. There are a few things to note here, though. The first is if you have a degree, let's say you're applying as an economist and your degree is in math or your degree is in statistics, that may be sufficiently related. So going to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, there is a tab. We were at the tab called What They Do. If we go to a different tab called How to Become One, and you click on that, you'll see, let me read through. Um, Under education, there's a heading. Economists typically need a master's degree. That's okay. The regulations say you can qualify with a bachelor's. Positions in business research or international organizations may require a master's degree or a PhD. The next paragraph says to pursue an advanced degree in economics, program applicants may need to have completed undergraduate coursework in subjects such as economics or mathematics. So here, the Occupational Outlook Handbook itself is saying that coursework in economics or mathematics can qualify you to basically work or pursue an advanced degree as an economist. So if you do have a degree in a related field, and if you continue reading, it says candidates who have a bachelor's degree with sufficient course credits in economics, statistics, or mathematics may qualify for some entry-level economist positions. That is wonderful evidence for you. If you have a math degree or a statistics degree, you do want to look for language like that that makes it clear that your degree is related to economics. Now, what if your degree is in English? The example I used before. That is going to be more difficult to be approved, but what you want to do and think about is, have you completed any coursework in economics? You may have a minor in economics, or you might have written your thesis on a topic related to economics, or maybe you did independent research on economics, even though your degree is in English. In the past, we have included in clients' applications their transcripts showing that even though their degree is in English, they completed coursework in economics. I'm using this as an example. We've also gotten letters from the applicant's university, say from a dean or the head of their department, talking about how even though their majors in English, they completed coursework that does prepare them to work in economics. So there are ways to advocate and make the argument. But that being said, it is definitely more difficult to be approved if your degree is not related to the profession. So here on your screen, you just see the example of the Economist page on the Occupational Outlook Handbook. This is the summary page. If you look at the tabs, you can see the next one is what they do, and then the fourth one is how to become one. So if you are at your computer, it is good to go to this page yourself. So probably the most common question we get, and I think it's the title of this webinar, is does a TN visa require sponsorship? Um, the word sponsorship has a specific meaning in U.S. immigration law. There are certain visas, green cards that require that the U.S. employer, quote unquote, sponsor the worker. For example, H-1B, employment-based green cards. What that usually means is that the U.S. employer needs to pay oftentimes a prevailing wage, which is higher than the minimum wage. The US employer may need to test the US labor market. They might need to advertise the job for a certain period of time to see if any US workers are able and willing and available for the position. The US employer might need to pay for the employee's travel back home. There are a number of requirements that come with sponsorship, as sponsorship is used in US immigration law. The TN visa requires none of that. And for that reason, we would argue that the TN visa does not require sponsorship. What the TN visa requires is for the US employer to make an offer, a job offer to the candidate, to the employee, the prospective employee, um, and to represent its intentions, the employer's intentions, through a signed letter. And that letter will be part of the application packet. But that signed letter, again, is just expressing the US employer's intentions, that they intend to employ the worker for 3 years, for example, that they intend to pay the worker $110,000 a year as salary. Um, the employer letter is not a contract. It is not a letter that keeps the employer from firing the worker if the worker is not doing well. It doesn't prevent the employee from quitting. The employee is typically an at-will employee, so they have freedom to quit. The U.S. Employer has freedom to fire the worker if it's not working out. So there is no requirement that the employer tests the labor market, make sure there's a U.S. worker who's eligible for the job and available. No requirement to pay a prevailing wage above minimum wage. Um, no requirement to pay for the employee's travel back home if work doesn't work, if the job doesn't work out. So none of those requirements apply. The requirements really are minimal on the employer. Um, the the one thing I will quickly add is if the employee is applying for the visa at a consulate or is applying for TN status at the border at a port of entry, um, it is the employee that's applying. So the employee is the applicant, and if the application is denied, it is the employee who is denied. If the individual is already inside the US and is applying to USCIS for a change of status to TN status, then it is the US employer that is applying. And the employee, we'll talk in more detail about what that process is. But it's a very small nuance that it's the employee who applies at a consulate or the border. It is the employer that applies if you're inside the US and applies to USCIS. That does not change the requirements on the employer. What it means is that the employer does need to sign the forms that go to USCIS, but Still, the employer does not need to test the labor market. They don't need to pay a prevailing wage. The requirements on the employer are still the same, regardless of how the application is filed. So, there are some nuances depending on whether you are a national of Canada or Mexico. And just to summarize what we're about to talk about, Canadians have an additional way to apply for the TN status that is much easier. It is by far the easiest way to apply, and it's available only to Canadians. Um, so uh, let's talk about what that option is. Canadians can apply at a port of entry, so they can arrive either at an airport, let's say Pearson in Toronto. They can apply, they can arrive at a land crossing between the U.S. and Canada or the U.S. and Mexico, and they can submit their TN application at that time. And the officer will look at the application and decide the application on the spot. So, as you can tell, this is a very fast process. It's relatively inexpensive. It's very easy. So for nationals of Canada, we almost always will advise that they apply in that way, applying at a port of entry or at an airport. Um, Canadians also have the option, though, and the next two options are also available to nationals of Mexico. They can also apply at a consulate, so they can file the DS 160 application form online, go to the consulate for an interview, and if approved, get their TN visa in their passport and come in that way. So that's the second way, is at a consulate. And the third way that someone can apply for TN status is from within the US. If they're already inside the US, say they're here as a student and they get a job offer, they can apply to change their status to TN status. And again, that option, I get only available to those inside the US, um, is available to nationals of Canada or Mexico. The option to apply at a consulate is available to nationals of Canada or Mexico, but only Canadians can apply at a port of entry. Um, Now, a few things to keep in mind. Why would a national of Canada apply at a consulate since they have such an easy option to apply at a port of entry? Oftentimes, the reason um, is that they have a spouse or a child who's not a national of Canada. So the port of entry, meaning Customs and Border Protection, can only decide TN applications for nationals of Canada. So if, for example, you are a national of Canada, but your spouse is a national of India and is a permanent resident of Canada, say, but they don't have their Canadian passport, your spouse would need to apply at the consulate. And given that clients will sometimes say, well, I'll just go with them and apply at the consulate as well. Other than that, most nationals of Canada are going to apply at a port of entry, at the airport or at a border. Um, Now, one other little nuance is that nationals of Mexico can actually apply um, for a 4-year visa. So this is nationals of Canada cannot. So nationals of Canada will get a 3-year visa if they go to the consulate. Nationals of Mexico can pay for a 4-year visa. So that is a nice little perk available to nationals of Mexico if they don't want to pay the increased fee, which is not much. They can get a visa for a shorter period of time. We tend to recommend just paying the fee so you have a 4-year visa, so you don't have to keep going back to the consulate. And in certain cases, for nationals of Mexico, when they apply to renew their visa, sometimes the consulate will say, you don't need to actually come in for the interview, just mail us your passport. We'll put the visa in and give you the new one, renewal by mail. That is very convenient. The consulate will let you know if you qualify for that at the time you apply. You don't typically request it beforehand. You do still need to be in Mexico to do this, though. You can't mail your passport from the US. It's probably not a good idea to do so either, and not have your passport. So you need to go to Mexico, and then in Mexico, you need to mail in your passport to the consulate if you want to do the renew by mail option. So, one of the requirements, if you remember, is you do need to be coming to the US to fill one of the listed professions. And if you remember, all of the professions They have their own qualification requirement. Not all of the professions are created equal, meaning some are more difficult than others to be approved for. And two of the categories that are uniquely challenging are management consultant and economist. They're difficult for completely different reasons, but let's start with management consultants. The reason this category is difficult is it is one of the few TN categories that does not require a degree. So if you did not get a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, and you really want to come to the US on a TN visa to work, you are probably going to have to apply as a management consultant. And the government knows that many people just fall into the management consulting category because of that, not because they're actually going to work as a management consultant, but because they don't have a degree, and really don't qualify as a management consultant. But because they don't have a good degree, this is going to be their only option. So as a result, the government really closely scrutinizes management consultant applications. Now, one note about this is there is a spectrum from risky management consultant applications to not risky management consultant applications. The not risky version is if you are coming to the US to work at a management consulting firm as a management consultant. So if you've been working in Mexico City for McKinsey, and the Mexico City office wants you to come to New York to work for their New York office at McKinsey. That's not a particularly challenging application, because, again, you're coming to the US to work for a management consulting firm. However, if the US employer is not a management consulting firm, that's where these applications get challenging. The example I like to use is, let's say that you are an expert in the design and manufacture of solar panels. And a US company that manufactures solar panels wants to hire you to advise them on their manufacturing process to bring down the cost. So they're going to hire you as a management consultant. You're going to go and you're going to share your expertise manufacturing solar panels. The solar panel company is not a management consulting company. So this is going to be a difficult application. That's not to say it's not going to be approved. You just need to take certain things into account when you're filing this application. The first and most important thing you need to take into account is, if you are coming to the US to work as a management consultant for a company that's not a management consulting firm, then you need the entire arrangement of the engagement needs to look like an independent contractor and a management consulting engagement. What do I mean by that? If you let's say your company hires McKinsey to consult, and so McKinsey sends a management consultant to your company. Your company's not going to put that person on payroll. They're not going to make them a full-time employee. They're not going to say you have to show up at 8 a.m. and leave at 5 p.m. That's an employee. That's a full-time employment role. A management consultant comes in to address a very specific and defined problem that a company is facing. They study that problem, they define the problem, they define possible solutions, and then they work with management to address those and implement those solutions. So that's what the engagement needs to look like. The US employer, if you're coming to the US, again, this is an employer that's not a management consulting firm. The US employer needs to define the challenge they're facing. They need to explain why you, as a management consultant, are the ideal person to address that challenge. There needs to be typically a management consulting agreement in place that talks about what the deliverables will be. In months 1 through 3, you're going to study the problem. You're going to create certain presentations. In months 4 through 6, you're going to be presenting those to management. In months 7 through 9, you're going to be looking at the implementation, and you're going to be paid based on these deliverables. That's what a management consulting agreement looks like. So what you see on your screen is really a reflection of that. Really, the last bullet here. Unless the applicant is coming to work for a management consulting firm, the position must be supernumerary. supernumerary is not a common word. We never use it. But in immigration, what it means is that it's a role that basically it's not a permanent role. So you're not coming to the US to fill a role that's permanent at the US company. In other words, you're a contractor. You're coming to advise and then you're going to leave. Um, for this reason, it is oftentimes strategically important that the TN be for short for fewer than 3 years. And the reason for that is it is a fairly long engagement to have a management consultant come for 3 years to advise on a problem. So rather than doing that, define the problem, define exactly how this consultant's going to help, and limit the time period to what you actually need, whether that's a year, maybe 2 years, typically not 3 years. Um, we do help many, many employers and prospective employees with this category. So it's worth scheduling a consultation. This is probably the most complicated TN category, management consultant. Economist is also a very uh, complicated, challenging category. And the reason is that in 2017, the government issued a policy memo that basically said, um, we don't think economists do certain things. And so stop allowing people in as economists if they're working as financial analysts and market research analysts or market research analysts. So what does that mean for you? If you are coming to the US as an economist, go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook and make sure that your job duties are aligned with what the government thinks economists do. Um, if you are coming to the US to work as a financial analyst or a market research analyst, um, you're probably going to be denied. Financial analysts work for, in general, financial institutions to find opportunities to generate profits, use investments to generate profits. Market research analysts are really researching the market to find opportunities to advertise goods and products, goods and services for the company. Um, if you want a more nuanced, explanation of what they do, the Occupational Outlook Handbook is a great resource. So look at financial analysts on the Occupational Outlook Handbook and market research analysts. There, you're going to see the job duties. And if your job duties are similar to what financial analysts or market research analysts do, you really do need to talk with the US employer to see if you actually can perform job duties that are similar to what economists do as defined on the Occupational Outlook Handbook. If they say no, we actually don't need someone to do that. Unfortunately, you're probably not going to be able to get a TN because again, you need to fit into one of the defined professional categories. One option might be working as a management consultant if, for example, they have a defined marketing problem that you're going to come in and address for them as a management consultant, that could work. But if that's not going to work, you probably are going to need to look for other visa options, and we're happy to talk with you about that. All right, let's talk a little more about what the application process looks like. Again, so if you see the first bullet on your screen, applying at a port of entry, this is only available to nationals of Canada. Again, they can apply at pre-clearance at an airport, or they can apply at a land crossing, or when they land at a U.S. airport, they can apply for the TN. So what are they going to provide? They're going to provide a TN packet of information, and this is going to be the same whether you're applying at a consulate or USCIS or at a port of entry. The most important thing meaning the first thing that the officer is probably going to look at is a letter from the U.S. employer. So you do need to have a letter from the U.S. employer. It's not just a job offer letter. We call it a TN employer letter. Typically, what it is going to say is who the U.S. employer is, why they need someone in this specific role, who you are as the employee applicant, what your qualifications are according to the TN regulations. You have a baccalaureate degree, for example, or you have 5 years of experience. Um, how long they plan to employ you, up to 3 years, what they plan to pay you, and what your job duties are going to be in the US. So that's typically what is in the employer letter. And the US employer is going to print that on their letterhead, and it needs to have an original signature. That is critical. So that letter from the employer is really going to frame the entire TN application. The rest of the documentation in the packet is going to be original documents showing how you qualify. So if you're qualifying based on a baccalaureate degree, you need to have your actual diploma with you, the original, not a copy. If you are including a transcript because your degree is a related degree, you need to have certified copies of the transcript. If you're qualifying based on experience, you need to have letters with original signatures from your past employers on their official letterhead, explaining the period of time that you worked for them. So, um, the additional documentation is really going to just support the argument that you qualify for the TN. Um, Again, you do want originals if you're applying at a port of entry or at a consulate. If you're applying through USCIS, meaning you're already inside the US, USCIS prefers copies, so don't send originals to USCIS. Um, of course, you also need proof of citizenship, so you need to have your passport with you when you're applying at a port of entry or the consulate. Some ports of entry are optimized for faster TN processing. So we do recommend you go to the CBP website and find out what ports of entry are optimized for first-time applicants. Um, you also we do always recommend that you call ahead of time just to make sure you're aware of the procedures at the specific port of entry where you're going. Um, we're going to have a bit more information on this later in the presentation, so I'm not going to say too much more about it now, other than to say one of the services we provide to our clients is helping to strategize about the best way to apply. There are differences between different ports, especially if you have an application like a management consultant application. It can make a significant difference to apply at one port versus another, and we're happy to help you with that if you do want to work with us. The next option, applying at a consulate. So nationals of Mexico or Canada can pursue this option. Nationals of Mexico who are outside the US must apply at a consulate. To do that, they would file a DS-160 form. It's an online form. They'd pay the visa fee, schedule their biometrics, fingerprints. They'd have their interview. And then at the end of the interview, if they're approved, they get a visa stamp in their passport. That usually takes less than a week. Once they have that visa stamp and their passport back, they can come into the US to work for the US employer. And as I mentioned, to renew, sometimes the consulate will allow you to renew by mail. If you are inside the US and you do not want to apply at a consulate, or if you're Canadian, you don't want to apply at a port of entry, the US employer can file an application with the USCIS, and that application is a form I-129. And the employer would complete that form, would sign the form, and would include in the application copies of the documents that I mentioned before. So a copy of your diploma if you're qualifying based on education, a copy of your transcript, a copy of your experience letters if you're qualifying based on experience. It really depends on the basis for how you're qualifying. Um, and then USCIS would issue a decision. Fortunately, there is a premium processing option. You can get a decision within 2 weeks, about 2 weeks from USCIS, if you do pay an expedite fee of about $2,800. So it's not cheap, but you can get that decision within 14 business days from USCIS if you do premium processing. And again, that's available to both nationals of Canada or Mexico who are inside the US. So some common tips and pitfalls. As I mentioned, call ahead to the port of entry. It's always a good idea just to see if their procedures changed. Make sure that the person who signed your employer letter is available at the time you're going to the consulate or the port of entry. There are times when the officer will actually call that person. It's not typical, but it has happened. So maybe it's always a good idea to give the author, the signatory, a heads up. I'm going to be at the port of entry around 12, around noon tomorrow. If you don't mind having your phone on you, it can be a good idea. And the officer is really just wanting to verify that the job is legitimate. It's usually not a really in-depth conversation. Uh, as I mentioned, bring originals of your diploma, transcripts, original signed version of the employer letter if you're applying at a port of entry or a consulate. It's just not worth showing up with a copy and risking being rejected. You waste a lot of time by doing that. So just get the originals and do it that way. Finally, the TN visa is a non-immigrant visa. So you may be asked to show evidence that you plan to leave the US at the end of your TN status. This usually does not come up if it's your first, second, or even third TN. Excuse me. But if you are on, say, year 8, 9 of being on a TN, you've renewed a few times, then you may be asked to show that you actually plan to go back at the end of your TN. And usually it's sufficient to show that you have a bank account abroad, that you have some funds in an account abroad. You may have property abroad. Minimal evidence is usually fine. Excuse me. But again, this usually does not come up the first few years that you're on the TN. All right. And I think we have a few questions that came in. All right. My degree is in civil engineering. I want to work in IT. Is it possible? The first thing you are going to need to do is think about what your job duties in the US are going to be. And once you've decided what those job duties will be, I recommend you go to the Occupational Outlook Handbook, see what profession listed in the TN regulations matches what you want to do. You're not going to find anything necessarily that has IT in the title, but if you look, there are roles like computer systems analyst, engineer might be one that works. It really depends on what you're going to be doing, but that's what you have to do. You have to look at the list of professions, find out which is the best fit, figure out if you have the qualifications, and if the U.S. employer is going to have you work in those job duties. This is what we help our clients with. So if you do want to work with us, we'd be happy to do that. Or if you want to schedule a consultation, that'd be great as well. Um, how big should the employer be? Great question. So the TN regulations are wonderful in that they do not actually have a requirement for the U.S. employer size. A U.S. employer can be a corporation, an LLC, even a sole proprietor. So that means you could have someone, just a person who has a law firm in the US, and it's really just them, just a one person law firm, and they want to hire you as a lawyer. That could work. That's fine from the US employer standpoint. So there is no minimum size that the employer needs to be. That being said, if you do need to think about the optics of the application. So what I mean by that is, let's say that you have a one person sole proprietor law firm and you're applying for a management consultant position to work for them. That just looks weird. Right? You're going to have to convince a government officer that a one person company needs a management consultant to address an issue. That might be hard to do. So think about the role that they're offering you and why the nature of the US employer requires that role. But based on the regulations alone, there is no minimum size that the employer needs to be. Can you highlight more on TN as an accountant? Well, really, the all there is to highlight is what's in the regulations. So, and the Occupational Outlook Handbook. So, if you want to come to the US as an accountant, you need either a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree in accounting or finance or related field, or a professional license like a CPA, CA, CGA, or CMA. And then you need to be coming to the US to work as an accountant, according to how the Occupational Outlook Handbook defines it. So that, frankly, that's really what there is to it. If you have more specific questions, feel free to ask or to schedule a consultation. But that's the process. Do accountants have to show why they want to hire an individual on a TN? They could have someone in the US as an accountant. Um, so fortunately for a TN, the US employer does not need to test the labor market. So they do not need to show that there is not a qualified US worker. So as long as you meet the requirements for an accountant, you have a baccalaureate or a licenciatura degree, or a professional license, and the employer is willing and able to employ you as an accountant, that's really it. You don't need to show that you have tested the market. All right, so let's see. Um, we're not going to go through whether you qualify based on background and degree. If you would like to discuss that, please do schedule a consultation. How long should the company be in business? There is no requirement, as long as it makes sense that they need someone in your role. If you're starting an accounting firm and you've just started it and you found an amazing national of Mexico who could fill the role of an accountant, that's fine. How does USCIS find out that an individual is actually performing his duties? I wish I knew. The fact is, though, that they oftentimes do, so I wouldn't risk it. Um, they have become quite savvy at signing contracts with companies like Palantir that use artificial intelligence to scrape online data, scrape social media accounts. So I really wouldn't risk it, especially in this day and age. If you represent something to the government, you really should stand by it because if you don't, the government is likely to come back and accuse you of fraud and misrepresentation, and that becomes far more difficult to overcome, whether you're applying for a visa, a green card, or anything else. So do keep that in mind. When applying through a platform like Indeed or ZipRecruiter, they ask whether I'm authorized to work in the US or I need sponsorship. Up to now, I've been selecting that I'm not currently authorized and I do need sponsorship. This is an excellent question. I'm really glad you asked this because employers and online platforms, they unfortunately have you check a box, and it's an either or box. Either you need sponsorship or you're authorized to work in the US and you don't need sponsorship. And that's not a fair way of framing the question. If that is the way the question is framed, frankly, I would say no, I don't have work authorization. If they're forcing you to do it that way, you clearly don't have work authorization, I would not say that you do have work authorization. But if the question is, do you need sponsorship or do you not need sponsorship? I would check that I do not need sponsorship. But ideally, there is an opportunity to have a discussion um, with the employer and to explain, look, I'm applying for a TN visa that actually does not require you to sponsor me. And if you would like, there is a law firm, Scott Legal PC, that's happy to talk with you about this. We do have those discussions with prospective employers. We're happy to do that and to explain exactly what the requirements on the employer are, and that they do not need to sponsor you. But I agree. The way that a lot of the online applications work, it's binary. It's either or, and neither option actually is accurate. Um, so that is unfortunate. But hopefully you can reach a human being and explain to them that, you don't actually need sponsorship. All right. Well, I think we have gone through all the questions. Katie, I'll pass it back to you.
Yeah, thank you everybody for attending the webinar. And if you have any questions or would like to set up a consultation, we look forward to speaking with you and you're welcome to contact our office.
Thank you so much.